Faron Manuel here, curator here at Black Art in America, also director of the Bio Foundation. I want to welcome you all to Landscapes for Richard Mayhew. We're honoring this masterful, legendary artist at his centennial. So, we're thinking about 7 decades of learning, lineage, legacy, and also his dual heritage of being African American and Shinnecock Native American. I'll be doing a presentation for you all today on some extensive research I've done on Richard Mayhew. And I'll end with a couple of highlights from the show to give you all a different lens for when you take a second look at it. Okay. So I wanted to start with these images of Joe Overstreet, an abstractionist, and looking at some works by Richard Mayhew and Robert Duncanson. And this picture really got me thinking about this. This was in 2015. So this picture has me thinking about how most people view the landscape and typically think about it as a faithful depiction of what we see outdoors. But you know how these artists are and how they can reinterpret everyday things and give new meaning, and also bring new concepts forward through things that we're used to seeing. And can you see the mouse on the screen? Okay. If you see this piece here, this is an example of Richard Mayhew's work here, and this is a seascape by Duncanson. So I'm gonna start with Thomas Cole, who's considered by a lot of art historians as the originator of America's earliest art form, which is landscape painting. And Thomas Cole was the arbiter of what's known as the Hudson River School. This piece here to your left, my right, the furthest to the left, is a scene from that region. And the Hudson River School was like this loose fraternity of artists who all took inspiration from being in this natural environment. A lot of them were just kind of out in the woods, living in shacks, living in tents. And they would go out daily to paint. They would have conversations. And there was this community, this sense of community, where people were discussing different concepts, best practices for depicting the landscape. But something else started to happen there. And within the creative process of a lot of these painters, they wanted to address different social issues that were going on in the 1800s. So these are things like deforestation. These are things like Native Americans being moved off of their land. These were things like the effect of industry. And you see a lot of that in the painting, in the paintings by some of these artists. These are examples of other works by other Hudson River School artists. So Robert S. Duncanson, renowned African-American landscape painter. And this is for, another scholar to take on. I've done a lot on Richard Mayhew, but for somebody else, it's said that Duncanson would even add certain symbols in his work, like birds in different locations that would indicate hints at the Underground Railroad. So these are the type of subtle messages that can kind of be inlaid into landscape paintings. And the piece to the right is by Asher B. Duran, who's also a renowned landscape painter, who kind of kept the discipline of landscape painting going when people were finding all of these new art forms more exciting than the landscape. They had, kind of seen so many landscapes, started to get used to them, and people just wanted to explore new avenues of creativity. Now, this piece by Thomas Cole is titled The Tempest. And in The Tempest, what you have in the foreground, you have a woman who's fallen ill, who's being cared for by these people, but you have a storm rolling in. You have trees just kind of violently moving. You have the little house on the prairie that's kind of in the distance, and it doesn't look very stable. And you see a number of these paintings where a storm is rolling in from the left corner of the piece. And landscape paintings grew to represent a lot of the subconscious fears that early Americans had by settling the land here. So, there would be, prevailing things of like Native Americans trying to, come out of the woods and reclaim land. The small shack that's not really secure being battered by a storm. And all of these things are representative of those early fears. And some of these artists like Thomas Cole were very deliberate in portraying that and communicating a different way of approaching and dealing with nature and also dealing with the people of the land here. So George Ennis, who's Richard Mayhew's greatest inspiration, American artist, life date 1825 through 1894, George Ennis was deeply engaged in the tonalist tradition, which is the study of how tones and shadows convey emotion in artwork. So you have these deep, dark tones to convey a somber mood and different emotional states into the landscape. So even though you have a landscape depiction, you have an emotional field of study. And this can be seen in Richard Mayhew's early work. You have a lot of traditional landscape painting themes. And as he got more engaged in tonalism, he was able to communicate emotion in a greater range within his paintings. So again, this is a piece by George Ennis. And this is an early piece by Richard Mayhew in 1960. And I want you all to pay close attention to when I get around like 1966. And I'm gonna throw out like a pop quiz question to you all. So these are some of Richard Mayhew's works once he got further into that tonalist tradition. And if you notice, the works are starting to get darker. There's a lot more shadowing. There's a lot more distortion due to a lack of light. The titles are like West and also Interlude, an interlude to Wet. And Richard Mayhew is thinking about emotional resonance, and him being Native American and African American during the time of the turbulent civil rights movement and conveying his emotions through his artwork. You can kind of see that in the tonation and the shadowiness of his work. There are some pieces where it starts to get so dark, you can't even interpret it as a landscape. So enters Spiral. So during the 1960s, you have the civil rights movement, which was the popular civil rights movement was spurred by the lynching of Emmett Till. And people were, protesting, advocating for rights to vote. But in the art world, there wasn't a lot of, direct advocacy of integrating museums or shifting art practice by, people like Dr. King. They had other, more tangible issues to focus on. But within the art world, you got a group of artists together and they created this think tank known as Spiral. So in Spiral, you had Romare Bearden, you had Hale Woodruff, you had Richard Mayhew, Norman Lewis, Faith Ringo would attend some of the meetings. But something that Richard Mayhew revealed is that Spiral wasn't just visual artists in the group. You also had people like James Baldwin and Richard Wright. And just imagine the level of a think tank with all of these creatives having conversations about how they're making their art, how they're approaching the society, how they're inspiring people through their work, and also how they're communicating their own experience with the outward world through their work. And Richard Mayhew considers Spiral to be his real education. It's where he really got educated in a way that was beyond the norm. So, think about having a teacher like James Baldwin teaching you about racial politics and then having a conversation with Romare Bearden. I put this Bearden collage here to make a particular point that Bearden would have the other members of the group making collages. And Richard Mayhew was trying to make collages and just trying to go along and get into like the figurative space. And he just told Romare, like, what am I doing with this, this cut paper? This isn't the medium for me. I can do what you're doing with this, with the landscape, with tonalism, with treading the line of abstraction. And throughout his creative journey and his journey towards mastery, he was eventually able to prove this in a recognizable way. I want to digress for a second too to highlight the landscape as therapy and the landscape as a healing component for the artist. So the piece to your far left is titled "Behold Thy Son," and it's a piece by David Driscoll where he's reinterpreting and adding a biblical narrative to the lynching of Emmett Till. And he's thinking about the moment where his mother saw his mangled body. He's also thinking about when Mary saw Jesus, the Christ, mangled in the same sense, and how both of those incidents inspired change in the world. And after creating that piece, he said he went to a place emotionally where he couldn't stay there and he couldn't keep creating that work, but he had to get that out of his consciousness. And from there, for the next few years, David Driscoll started to make landscapes. He said he couldn't deal with people anymore, and trees were a lot more polite and easier to deal with. And so this is a personal thing that David Driscoll told me while looking at some of his landscapes. He didn't want to deal with people, and dealing with the landscapes served as an escape for him. And just to get the wheels turning about, emotional resonancy, and also where artists have to go sometimes to communicate things and where they go for retreat. So back to Richard Mayhew and his involvement with Spiral, his thinking about civil rights, his thinking about racial politics, his thinking about advocacy in the country. You notice the title of this piece is Rise. It was purchased for the Tougaloo College collection, and it was purchased with funds from Artists for Congress of Racial Equality. So you have, advocates in the society who are connecting with Richard Mayhew's work, and he's still in that tonalist space. This piece was added to Tougaloo College's collection in 1964. So still during that era, you see a lot of the tonalist moments, but it's a hillside and it's titled Rise. And he kind of stylized Rise so to make it kind of, he put a little stank on it. Okay. So in the broader world, what did you have happening in 1964, 5, 6? You had the passing of the Civil Rights Act. You also had the passing of the Voting Rights Act. At that point, Spiral had disbanded. A lot of the members of the group had felt, we've arrived. We don't really need to have these meetings anymore because, we got the Civil Rights Act. People can't legally discriminate because of X, Y, and Z. Let's disband the meetings. Richard Mayhew actually wanted to continue the meetings and kind of pulled on the group to inspire them to continue to have this think tank because it would continue to be important. But, some of these artists did start to get other opportunities because of the Civil Rights Act. But Richard Mayhew's idea was to keep that wise counsel and to continue to meet and to continue to advocate as a unit. And they put on a series of shows. The first show that they did, I'll go back to the flyer, it was a grouping of works in black and white. So that was a messaging from the group of artists creating these works in unison to get people thinking about the topic of racial inequality. Okay. So after the Civil Rights Act was passed, after 1966, Richard Mayhew started to add the colors that we've become accustomed to. So these acid tones in his work and these bright, vivid colors, he started to abstract a bit more and started to take more control of the landscape. So thinking about his involvement and his interest in tonalism or communicating with shadows, as he got older and started to master that as an art form, he developed a broader range of communicating emotion. He started to communicate other experiences. And as an undercurrent in his work, that's one of the components and the reasonings for the colorway starting to change. Because once you go so dark, where else do you go as a creative? He ended up breaking through at that point. This is in the 1970s. And these are works from different public collections. I looked over Richard Mayhew's CV. Again, he's 100 years old. His CV is like 88 pages. But this is in, an abstract piece, an oil painting. It's in a public collection in a bank in Missouri. And also look at the titles of his artwork. Something that Richard Mayhew has stated on several occasions is that I'm painting the treaty lands for the Native Americans that were never realized. I'm painting the 40 acres and a mule that were never granted to the African American. So he's thinking about both of his heritages as a Shinnecock Native American from his grandmother's side, and also as an African American from his mother's side, well, his father's side and his mother's side. But the title of this piece is Indigenous Spiritual Space Series. So he did a series of landscapes where he's communicating the emotions and the thinking of an indigenous spiritual space. He's thinking about valuing the land in a different way that's more inward. And he also considers his works to be mindscapes. So he actually got away from the point where he was looking at nature as a reference, where he, says that he felt like he's seen every kind of leaf, every kind of tree, and he started to go more inward. He started to communicate his thoughts and emotions on various different topics. Sometimes his paintings are just how he feels about a particular person. He has a few paintings with the name Pamela as a representation of his greatest patron and collector, where he uses like a lot of like loud like pinks and yellows, but he's thinking about different things, and he's really, I say like transmuted tonalism from going all the way dark to going to another place where he's again taking control of the land. And this piece to the right, Desert Serenade, was completed in 1993. Both of these are from 1993, but you see how after 1966, you started to get these pieces that we typically think of when we think of a Mayhew painting. I'm going to read this quote from an essay. So you all are getting, from my essay, you all are getting like a sneak peek of the catalog we're working on with this one. So his frequent declaration that he's painting 40 acres and a mule and the treaty lands that were never honored for Native Americans reflects his complex relationship to the American landscape, using landscape painting as a medium, or as he describes them, mindscapes. Mayhew transforms the natural environment into a visual language that reflects his psychological and emotional state, forming a deep therapeutic with nature. Now, thinking about Richard Mayhew's journey and how he was able to educate himself, and how I highlighted Spiral as what he considered his real education. So back in, Richard Mayhew's emergence as an artist, you typically couldn't just go to an arts college and get a degree, but he also doesn't profess himself as a self-taught artist. He talks about different experiences, working with different instructors to develop different skill sets from different lineages that he kind of cobbled together and created an education. So having this admiration for George Ennis, he took a trip to Europe and just painted landscapes there. He just studied how shadows hit the land, how it affected his inward mood. He also, as a 14-year-old, he met this professional medical illustrator by the name of James Wilson Peale. And for the next 3 summers, he would take classes with Peale, and he learned the traditional techniques of the Hudson River School. So the Hudson River School really gave him his start. He also says that he had a seascape that his dad created in the house when he was a kid. But this is really where he started to get some formal training and to learn art in a very disciplined way and to get the traditional elements of landscape painting. So since, being a 14-year-old to being a 100-year-old, just thinking about, how deeply he's thought about this process and what he's been able to figure out about conveying the landscape. At the age of 17, he ended up moving to Brooklyn, where he started to take courses at the Brooklyn Museum. He also started to work with artists like Edward Dickinson, and the other artist was Max Beckman, where he started to study abstraction, and he started to study additional techniques in landscape painting. So he has a mixture of all of these different lineages kind of playing into his work. And once you get up to the 1960s, people are really starting to get into conceptual things like jazz and getting into abstraction. Richard Mayhew's landscapes are also informed by jazz, and these out of focus colorways to the landscape are his take on abstraction, but also his commitment to landscape painting in an era where landscape painting was in eclipse. It was falling out of favor. He was, being told that this isn't really a relevant art form early on. But once he got to the point where he broke through and started to master tonalism and started to add his own take to it, it received new relevancy. And arguably the most important landscape painter living today, Richard Mayhew really set the tone for advancing the landscape and getting contemporary artists interested in an art form that people had started to overlook. So when you come to this show, most of these works don't have the appeal of a traditional landscape. There's something different from the abstraction here, from even the traditional mastery of artists like a Mason Archie or a Dean Mitchell. But you also have some variation of work like the work by Freddie Styles and even in Najee's work. And Freddie Styles mentioned at the opening of the show that back when he was in college, this is back in the 70s, he saw one of Richard Mayhew's paintings in the International Review of African American Art. And seeing that one painting inspired him to take on a career of landscape painting. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, Freddie Styles and Richard Mayhew had a 2-artist show at September Gray Gallery. So you think about lineage, you think about inspiration, even in paintings and etchings I've seen by Richard Mayhew completed in the 70s. This man was 50 years old. These things were masterfully executed, excellent technical ability. And to think he got 50 more years after that to gain additional knowledge and to tell other stories and to deal with other things that he was grappling with internally. Also thinking about the landscape as a refuge, and how an artist can typically retreat to the landscape as a way to get away from dealing with difficult subject matter. Quite a few people have had the same response from seeing this show. There's a certain serenity in the works that are displayed, in the way that they're able to capture the audience and to put them in a different space mentally than always not expanding. Nothing wrong with other art forms, but it's always great to kind of take a moment to kind of expand the horizon and get into some other things. Now, something else about Richard Mayhew's work and how he treads the line of abstraction, he treads the line of landscape painting, and he also treads the line of social critique. So these are things that people often think of as being very different, very disconnected, but Richard Mayhew has really proven that all of these things can go hand in hand. They don't always have to, and I'm not simply trying to say that his work is about civil rights. I'm just saying that he's garnered the ability to use abstraction and to use landscape painting as a form of communicating. And he's invited people to go on this journey with him through viewing his work, through listening to his talks, and through just studying his path and studying his lineage. The way that this exhibition is laid out, I wanted to highlight some key points in Richard Mayhew's journey. So starting on this end, I wanted to start with the work by Freddie Styles to kind of get people thinking about his inspiration for other artists and how he basically launched the career of a young college student that developed interest in landscape painting through seeing his work. And also highlighting traditional landscape painting that has that tonalist element. But going this way, it really highlights Richard Mayhew's travels west, where he started to experiment with additional colors and acid tones in his work. So before traveling west, he was dealing with more tonalism while living in New York. But once he got out to California, he said on that journey is when he felt as though he had seen every type of terrain and went across the country just kind of painting every scene on a road trip, where he would just kind of stop in Arizona. He would stop in New Mexico. He'd stop in different places in California. But then he gained the confidence after the repetition of going through all of these different natural environments and painting all of these different scenes, to where he developed the confidence to step away from the landscape and to kind of reinterpret on his own. So I wanted to represent his journey westward, also including some traditional landscapes, but also some works of abstraction to kind of show the range and everything that's within his body of work. So in this show, you have 18 contemporary artists that are working in ways that all somehow track back to the work of Richard Mayhew. And ultimately, through his journey, Richard Mayhew was able to revive an art form that had fallen out of favor. And eventually, the 14-year-old that started taking Hudson River School-based courses on upstate New York shore grew to connect America's earliest art form with contemporary art making. So thank you all. So I'll open for a few questions. I think we.
Yeah. Faron, often people always throw out the word master and stuff like that. In terms of, like your study of Richard, him being called a master, what's that made of? Not just his age or, something else, but just, can you give us a little bit more on that in terms of how you look at mastery?
Yeah, I would say. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you, a lot of people talk about, like throwing the word masters out. And I think they do it really frequently and stuff like that. And I don't know if they give enough understanding to, what it means to be a master in something. And
Okay.
So in terms of your study of Richard, Mr. Mayhew, can you give us some kind of idea in terms of what that means, mastery, and when you use that word?
I would say his commitment to a distinct discipline and him pursuing it until he figured it out. So, going back to tonalism, he found a teacher, a master teacher that was doing something that he was interested in, and he started to pursue it. And he pursued it to a point where he understood it, and he was also able to build upon it and add to it. And from there, he was able to change the art form. By being so heavily a part of it, he was able to take ownership of certain principles and to re-engage them and reuse them in his work.
I'm just saying, he also creates his own lineage then.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's inspired some other young,
Mm-hmm.
comparatively speaking to him, other young artists.
And that's the thing about, that cycle. Like it'll continue, and he'll even, like, he never met George Ennis, but he was a student from afar, and there was enough laid out where he could go and look at paintings. He would go to museums, even travel to Europe to see paintings. So he was that committed to where he was in the 1940s and 50s going overseas to look at paintings and to paint the same places where this got painted. So he just followed in the footsteps of another master artist, and that's how he started.
But I was really struck also by the organization of them in terms of spiral. I've never heard of that, and I'm kind of like committed to studying African American history and stuff. But it's so interesting to see people constantly organizing to try to get some relief for African Americans and stuff. So anything you can speak more on that would be great.
I would say most of the information I was able to find about Spiral was strictly about the visual artist, but to know that, he had the assistance of James Baldwin, Richard Wright, adding their experience, adding their knowledge, even adding their art form to this conversation. And he talks about this dance between artists and composers and writers, all in communication together. They realized that they were experiencing some of the same issues, and they could trade strategies on how to adjust the environment that they were living in.
So I'll pass the mic in 1 second, but I would like you to talk about, we had a conversation yesterday with a collector that came in who was building a collection. So many of the people that are here today have collected or are in the process of building a collection. It'd be great if you would share his question to you regarding, why landscape?
Okay. So a collector came through yesterday who expressed interest in, growing his collection, getting it to a point where he could travel it, have substantive books written about his collection, and have people experience it. He said he was deeply inspired by the Kinsey collection and others that are traveling their, things that they've acquired over the years for other people to see and learn from. And I started the tour, and he was kind of 25% interested. And he said, so why landscapes? I'm just be honest with you, I'm not that interested, but I would like to know, why is this something that I should consider? And I broke it down to him that, Richard Mayhew, the last living member of Spiral, was a part of these, social conversations in his work that, Romare Bearden, Hale Woodruff are known for social commentary because it's figurative, it's more familiar, it's easier to interpret. But Richard Mayhew was grappling with some of these same concepts and communicating them just as effectively if you only take time with the work. And the thing about collecting landscape paintings, especially from African American artists, you're really getting a unique experience that a unique group of people in America have had with the land. You think about Richard Mayhew stating, I'm painting the treaty lands for the Native Americans that they never got, and the 40 acres and a mule that was never received by African Americans. What's going into the creative process of him depicting the land to you? And what can that communicate to you to further spark ideas that could be beneficial in your life? So to think about, land ownership and telling the full story of our culture, a lot of this goes back to just expanding your horizons and considering other disciplines by artists, even abstraction, as well as landscapes. Yes.
Yes, I'm just
he's
Not in the sense of popularity, but in recognition. I mean, was he able to make a living out of what he was doing, and did he prosper over it as well?
now all artists who are not afraid to break away from the fold don't necessarily, prosper. As an observer, Richard Mayhew's he's done really well over the years. So having that 88-page CV got me a lot of insight into how many public collections his works are in, and he's internationally collected. So he's in museums and institutions all across the world. So throughout Europe, the United States, and other places. And surprisingly for an artist that was an outlier as far as his subject matter, he did really well through the years. And I actually think, even though he said what he needed to have said, creating landscapes was, in a way, it was kind of like a Trojan horse to bring issues of civil rights. You got a painting, that's talking about 40 acres and a mule. It might have a different title than that, but it's just in a bank. And once you really read into the title, you start to kind of learn what it's about. You have a painting, there's another one. You have a painting titled Rise, and it's just in a college. It's a landscape. It's not a person holding up a fist or a protest sign. We love those too, but there are different modes of communication. And I think him painting landscapes actually ended up helping him gain a broader acceptance. And I've even seen instances where people have tried to depoliticize what his work is about. And I've seen, comments in major publications saying his work isn't about, politics whatsoever. But it's like, did you read the titles of the work or study his experience or listen to any of his interviews or read anything significant about him? Yes.
So if you could just take us back to this time frame when the landscapes were in decline more broadly as a kind of subject matter, and he was going deep into this. Why, number one, were landscapes in decline? Two, although he ultimately received a lot of acknowledgement for his work, was that into this question here, was that during that time period where this was in a net decline? And also, given that it was not explicitly about social commentary, was the work collected by Black artists, Black collectors, people with Black interests, versus a much broader. So one, the time period of landscapes.
Okay.
Two, a little bit about who was collecting his work, and then a little bit about
Okay. So landscape painting has been noted by art historians as America's earliest art making tradition. So it's the first art tradition that was considered uniquely American. That at one point that was the most popular form of painting in America. So most artists would engage in landscape painting early on. And this is even before, let me see, this is like right around the moment before Richard Mayhew was even born. Landscape painting started to decline. You also had artists like this guy here. Let me go back. This piece titled In the Woods by Asher B. Duran. He was one of the folks that kept landscape, the Hudson River School, going after it had went in decline. So people started collecting artwork from Morocco. They got more access to travel, so they started collecting more international art. People started to move into cities, so they didn't want a painting of a barn in a condo downtown. It just kind of the interest of the majority of the population started to shift as far as their values. They started to urbanize. People are moving to places that are more industrialized, like New York. They're moving to Chicago. And they kind of took a step back from collecting landscape paintings. So with that, artists started to explore different things around the 1940s and the 50s, especially. And you also had the advent of jazz musicians hanging out with abstract artists. The music and the art kind of goes hand in hand. And people were just in a different era completely. And earlier on, Richard Mayhew, he wasn't really making, he had some gallery representation. He would make some sales, but he wasn't to the stature, that he is now and that he got to around like the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. But he started to he became a professor for a while. He took a number of different routes, but eventually just kind of being steady and being innovative. It was early on, it was a slower trickle, but people were collecting his work. And I say by the 90s, he was, quiet, like one of those quiet, renowned artists. So people knew that he was a member of Spiral, but even now, I don't think he gets the level of appreciation and recognition that he should get at the level that he's at. And also being, the last living artist one of the last living artists from that group that he was running with. He's not at the level of recognition that, I think he should be at, but he's still been a steady, like quiet force in the art world. And people that love his work really love his work. And, thankfully a number of people were able to acquire his work earlier on. Yes.
Is he still producing work?
Yes. So yeah, 100 years old, still producing. When he stopped by last year, he did like a quick sketch of Teresa, our gift shop manager. But I've heard that as he travels, he takes his painting supplies with him. He usually does watercolors while he's on the road. He's still like he was a young 99 when he came by. Like he was still kind of, agile and ready to create. But so yes, to answer your question, he does still produce, but just not at the same pace as earlier, but he still does.
Can you talk about some of his works that are in the show, any background you might have?
Yes. So you want to maybe re-ask because they want to record the question.
Can you talk a little bit about the Mayhew works that are in this show?
Yes. So the piece directly behind you all, it's the only oil painting in the show by Richard Mayhew. And this piece is titled Desert Serenade. It was created in 93, so it's a 30-year-old painting. And the thing about Richard Mayhew, he studied abstraction, he studied optical illusion, he studied landscape painting, tonalism, and you really can see elements of all of that in the work. There are even people who said that they've looked at his work and saw like hints at other things. So about like affect theory, or like when a psychiatrist shows you like the ink blots. People will pull some of those references when it comes to his work, and they'll see other things. But this oil painting titled Desert Serenade, it still has a lot of traditional landscape painting elements, but it's an out of focus landscape with this, more acid color tone, to the point where it does give that abstract feel. And there are 2 watercolors in the show that I presume he did while he was traveling, because that's typically the medium he worked in while he was away from his studio. It's a lot easier to kind of carry that around. So to do watercolors and to do drawings while he was out in the world. And it's 2 silkscreen prints in the show that he completed with the help of Curly Holton, master printmaker, who runs Raven Editions. And Curly has some watercolors in the show that depict his working relationship with Richard Mayhew. So you'll see those kind of throughout narrating the show. And 2 of them are actually with Richard Mayhew, created from photographs that Curly took over the years, but of Richard working on the 2 seriographs, and they're behind this wall. So on the main wall, behind this wall, and directly behind it. And the silk screen around the other side of this wall is a better example of his tonalist work. Something else he said about working in tonalism is, he could be thinking of, like a plantation while he's painting, and he's looking at a shadow. He's thinking like, could something have happened to a person in this corner of this painting? Or could somebody have escaped in this area? So he's deeply thinking about the history and different things that could have happened on the land through the years. So, oh.
I'm not familiar with his later works, and hearing you talk about the landscape, it's interesting to see how the work has changed from a traditional landscape to a mindscape, and how he's introduced the neon fluorescent colors. And I was wondering if you know more about like the technical part, like if you introduce it, the time, like the colors, the type of paint, all the mediums that have come about now. Like, is he interested in using or adding more to what he has been doing, like how he's changed the landscape from when he first started to now? I mean, considering there's so many options that way you could take a work, collage, and other ways of like adding to the landscape, and like this way how artists like Jack Whitney and there are other that speak about more of like abstract emotional landscape.
Well,
Can you speak on that?
well, the way, so in the video interview I saw, the way that he mentioned to Bearden how he wasn't dealing with collage no more, I don't think so. As far as adding anything new to his repertoire, but I think he's comfortable in being a traditionalist because he's added so much to it. Like he's taken things that are thought of as traditional and really carved out his own lane and went in his own direction through using traditional forms. And from the videos I've seen of him painting in his studio, he just kind of starts sometimes. He'll just kind of get some paint on the canvas and just make a mark and then just kind of go from there and figure out, you know, how he's feeling, what he's experiencing, what does this look like? What story can I tell with this mark that I just made? Is this a hill? Is it a valley? And he just kind of builds his paintings from there. Yes.
Any examples of his most recent work?
Yeah, I do. All right. Any examples of his most recent work? So this is a document I have of his works that are in public collections. A lot of these are from the 70s. And this one is from 2013. This is summation. So this one is in the show on the wall back there. This one is from 2013 and is titled A Landscape for Bob. So again, sometimes he thinks about, you know, people that he's connected to, the way they make him feel, and he'll, you know, create a piece connected to that person. This one is also in the show, A Tuscadero. And this has some of his more recent elements, but also some of the tonalist elements in here as well.
And he is currently painting, right?
Yes. He might be painting right now. Jamel, did you?
We've talked about his use of landscape, but can you talk about his palette? You talked about the tonalism, but as you're showing these works, you're also seeing that he is playing with colors that are more fluorescent
Mm-hmm.
and almost seem as though they are used with night colors on, you know, that kind of infrared, those infrared colors. So if in the 60s and 70s, he's talking about civil unrest or civil disobedience or questions that deal with civil rights. Not saying that you're speaking for him, but what would you surmise his transition from the darker tones into the brighter tones and then into the more fluorescence? Do you think that's maybe technology and being able to get those colors now, or do you think maybe it's more of a combination of conscious and technology?
I think it's a combination. So, you know, for one, it's more, you know, material available to artists. So, you know, kind of going back to Lillian's question about new media, you know, new options in, you know, ready-made paint are available now than when he started, you know, back in the 1940s. But so he does have access to new colors that he can use in his work. But even in, you know, witnessing and working with and experiencing these new colors, he's still tying it back to an inward state. So sometimes, you know, his subject matter might be about, you know, a battle scene where some natives lost their land. and he's, picking colors that communicate that. Or he's thinking about something like in his work, The Sentinels, that was done in 1966. It's just two trees just kind of at a slight distance. They have like this cool blue color tone, this bluish purple, this coolness. So what does a sentinel do? They like watch the door and they decide who and what comes in. So they kind of will have a coolness to them. So I think it's a mixture of technicality and also access to new material. 2 more questions and we'll wrap up. Oh, great.
Unless someone else hasn't asked the question.
Oh, no, you.
So 2 quick questions. Has there been an increase in demand and interest in landscapes more broadly, not just his work? And 2, you said that he's been a quiet but consistent force, and I'm wondering to what degree, because he kind of stuck with this one subject matter, it either allowed him to go deeper, but certainly sounds like it hindered him from reaching a broader audience or reaching a level of, respectability that others who, branched off into other things. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Andre 3000 and the Flute, like, just stick to rap, you know what I mean? Like, but in some ways, it sounds like this is what he wanted, independent of what the marketplace wanted.
Right. And I think sometimes too, like some creatives just get lucky in that way. They can create like independently of the marketplace and still succeed in it. So I think he was very fortunate in that way. As far as, my experience with working in museums, typically contemporary art is like the people's favorite. They like things that are new and exciting. And like American art tends to get less attention than, and I mean like traditional like landscapes and like antique furniture and those sorts of things tend to get less attention. And landscapes are, typically thought of as something people with a specialty are interested in. You do have a few collectors that'll venture off and get landscape paintings. But I think the way that Richard Mayhew grew to approach landscape paintings, it just gave him a broader audience than the typical traditional landscape painter. So we got room for one more question. Well, thank you all for coming out. I've enjoyed sharing with you all, and I hope I've kind of opened some people up to taking a second look at the show and maybe viewing through a different lens. Thank you.